Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel Analyze This Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. And today I'm digging into a common experience among Bond fans. In the course of a Bond fan's life, at some point you're going to be asked to introduce Bond to a Bond skeptic or a Bond agnostic, or maybe just someone who isn't really familiar with James Bond, the character, much at all beyond cursory cultural knowledge. That person could be a family member, it could be a friend, it could be a romantic partner. You're going to be tasked with introducing this iconic literary and cinematic figure, James Bond, to someone you know. And that situation has come up for me recently, and that's gotten me thinking about what Bond movie makes the best introduction of the Bond character in the year 2025. We obviously have many films to choose from, and obviously if we include the books, there are even more introductory points for the character, but I'm going to isolate the conversation just to the movies right now for the purposes of clarity and focus. There's a sense in which there's no perfect one singular Bond film for everyone. Everybody has their own particular idiosyncrasies, their own particular experience. So the idea that there could be one perfect on-road to the Bond film franchise is perhaps misguided. Nevertheless, it's interesting to reflect on this canon of Bond cinema and ask ourselves, what feels like a comfortable on-road to the series in the year 2025? We could start with the Connery era, which obviously is the most influential in terms of cinema history. The Sean Connery James Bond films are some of the most influential and iconic films ever made. For that reason alone, they demand to be seen. I'm glad we're going to have the 4K release of these films this year so that I can revisit them with fresh eyes myself. I think it's going to be such a wonderful opportunity to rediscover these cinema classics. Nevertheless, there's quite a bit of distance between 2025 and the Connery era, and there's a sense in which the Connery films really have to be appreciated in the context of their time. There's a little historical unpacking that needs to be done to enjoy the Sean Connery Bond films. They're maybe not the easiest on-road for a young person, say, in the year 2025, just because there's just so much cultural distance between 1962 and today. And it's also just tremendous cultural distance. The Sean Connery Bond films are blatantly rooted in a particular 1960s style of fantasy, a fantasy that is grounded in the daydreams of 1950s working dads who, may have a day life as an accountant that's very boring, but wants to dream about being this glamorous icon of virility who has a dangerous edge and saves the world. The Sean Connery Bond is very much embedded into a particular cultural consciousness. And it certainly sent shockwaves through cultural history. Without the Sean Connery version of that character, it's unlikely we'd be talking about the character today. And maybe that's a perfect reason to pick something like From Russia with Love and Goldfinger to introduce the character to a modern audience, to say, here's where it all began, and to begin to walk them through that influence, that cinematic influence. But nevertheless, I think there are elements of those movies that a young person today, especially one who doesn't have much context about the Bond phenomenon, might find a little challenging. That's not to say audiences won't enjoy those films. When I saw Goldfinger on the big screen the other year, the audience was devouring it. They were cackling with it. They were enjoying it for the time capsule that it was. But I think you have to find somebody who's generous and is willing to make that leap into the past in order to appreciate those films. It's been a hard enough challenge in my life to convince people to watch some of the black and white movies I love from the 30s and 40s. I have to imagine there's some challenge for some folks now just to look back and appreciate something as genuinely distant as the films of the 1960s. We could then talk about George Lazenby's On Her Majesty's Secret Service, now one of the most celebrated films in the series, acclaimed by many film directors as the best of the series. Christopher Nolan loves On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Peter Jackson loves On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Steven Soderbergh loves On Her Majesty's Secret Service. It has become revered. But the challenge with On Her Majesty's Secret Service is, as much as I find that it's a movie that has some really glamorous sweep, it doesn't really embody the Bond formula. If you watch and enjoy On Her Majesty's Secret Service, you don't really understand the broader Bond phenomenon. The tropes are there, but if we're being honest, George Lazenby's contribution to the Bond series does not fully embody the character that has become this tremendous icon. George Lazenby's Bond has a lot of fine attributes, but he never got to fully grow into the character, and there's a sense in which his portrayal feels somewhat unformed, even in the context of such a wonderful movie. It feels like an odd choice as an on-road to the series. The Roger Moore era, we could talk about, has many great films in it. Roger Moore is my second favorite Bond. I cherish those movies. And I wonder sometimes if the absurdity of those movies could make a comeback. We live in an era where something as outrageously silly and satirical as the Barbie movie can become a blockbuster hit. There's a sense in which maybe an absurdist Bond film could connect with audiences today, but I still wonder if the Roger Moore sense of humor is so rooted in its period of time, that sort of broad, play to the cheap seats, slapstick humor that defines a lot of the Roger Moore films might feel a little polarizing. They were even polarizing at the time. People who had grown up with Sean Connery, many of them had a struggle to adapt to the Roger Moore films, their more farcical nature, and a bit of a war broke out between the Sean Connery fans and the Roger Moore fans, and that battle has raged and calmed down over the years, but you still see those tensions creep into Bond fan conversations online. And as much as those two are the two real cinematic icons of the Bond series, and you kind of have to understand both of them to understand the Bond phenomenon, they're tastes that are very, again, rooted in a particular cultural moment. So that brings me to Dalton. And Dalton and Craig honestly deserve to be discussed together. They are flavors of the same approach to Bond, which is to ground it into darker psychology for the character. They're both very different portrayals of Bond. Timothy Dalton's Bond is much more of a seasoned, committed professional, whereas Daniel Craig's Bond is in more turmoil. He's a bit more chaotic as a character. He's a bit more frantic. But you kind of run into the same issue with the Dalton films that you do with the Daniel Craig films, which is that they're untraditional movies. The Living Daylights may be one of the better options here because it does both embody a slightly darker edge to the Bond character, which I think is something that still feels pretty relevant in 2025. I expect when we see the next Bond movie, there still is going to be a bit of a harder edge present for the character, but it marries that with a sense of adventure, a sense of absurdist set pieces. It can strike people as a bit of tonal whiplash, but it nevertheless encapsulates, I think, what a Bond movie is. The challenge is it doesn't embody the heights of the Bond phenomenon as cinematic spectacle, as grandiose entertainment. The Living Daylights is a subdued thriller. As a subdued thriller, it raises the question whether The Living Daylights can function as representative of the series. It has the same issue as something like On Her Majesty's Secret Service. The same is true of the Daniel Craig Bond movies. They are all pretty untraditional in their own ways. Casino Royale may be one of the better on-roads to the series that we could think of because it was, in 2006, the Bond film for people who hadn't really been on board with the franchise to date. It grounded the series in something new. It updated the character in some fairly radical ways, and it also subverted the character somewhat and created space for new territory to be explored. And Daniel Craig's Bond became the Bond of a new generation. But to really appreciate what Daniel Craig's Bond is doing, you kind of need some broader context of the Bond character. What is the Bond character doing? How does he behave in order to appreciate the extremes that Daniel Craig's Bond goes to? Maybe the Brosnan era is the answer. It's a compromise between many different extremes of Bond. Indeed, Pierce Brosnan's Bond is in many ways the all-arounder Bond, and maybe we should look to something like GoldenEye. Maybe we should look to something like GoldenEye to introduce the character to audience today, because it just not only is a film that updates the character for the then mid-90s with some understanding of who the character was before, where the character is going, it does its best to embody the tropes and traits of the character. And GoldenEye is what I selected. I had to show my girlfriend a Bond movie. She'd seen a few before, but she's really looking to understand what I enjoy about this character because she's very affirming of me and my own peculiar fascinations in life. So she wants a window into what I appreciate about this character, and I picked GoldenEye. It seems like a safe movie. It's not, at this point in time, one of my favorites in the series, but it seemed like a really safe option. And for the most part, she enjoyed it. I think what she ultimately struggled with is the issue that I think the Pierce Brosnan era has in general, which is that it's kind of tonally all over the place. You have absurdist stunts, you have harder edge dramatic moments, you have a romance that flirts with being something a little bit more serious, but also just feels as arbitrary as some of the Bond romances of the past. So it kind of sits in this non-committal space. As much as certain moments in GoldenEye just worked so well for her, she adored the absurdity of the tank chase, which filled me with joy, because I think that's one of the most classically Bond moments in the film, as is that opening section in Monte Carlo at the casino with Bond and Xenia playing cards against one another. Those pieces, they don't quite add up to a fully satisfying whole. And so that sort of sense of enjoyment, but longing for something that's a little bit more full-bodied remained at the end of the experience of GoldenEye. And I felt it too, even as a Bond fan who has cherished that movie. GoldenEye was the door that opened up my eyes to Bond, really. It was the video game that came out of that introduced the character to me. It was the advertisements for Tomorrow Never Dies, its sequel, that really gripped me with Bond. It may be a solid entry point, but it's also just kind of like a very safe movie. And maybe there's a case to be made for just taking a risk and going for one of the Bond films that's just like a bolder statement. And maybe I misjudged things there. Maybe I should have swung for one of those early Connery films that have really etched themselves into my consciousness, that really embedded themselves in the consciousness of young 11-year-old, 12-year-old Ryan who watched them on VHS with his father. So this is a video in some ways without a firm conclusion. There is no Bond film that's perfect as an introduction. In many ways, you just have to kind of trust your gut. And maybe that's the answer here, is if you're tasked with bringing someone into your own fascination with Bond, you should start with where you're fascinated with Bond, the movies that excite you. And because you're passionate for it, hopefully because of their affection for you, they'll be able to use you as a vehicle to seeing what was so special about the James Bond phenomenon that it has continued to excite audiences to this day. Let me know what you think. Do you think there is a Bond film that is a better introduction than any other? What would be your pick if you're going to introduce an agnostic to the Bond series and try to demonstrate what excites you about the Bond series? What movie would you pick? I'm very eager to hear. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.